Rick and Morty Comic Book 1 Bonus Shorts. For authenticity's sake, I've been reviewing this comic based on the deluxe hardcover volume books. Like the first volume has the first 10 issues. For some reason though, the book put all the side stories of the main issues at the very end, together. I'm disappointed I have to do it like this, but my first issue review was over 20 minutes as it was, with just one story. So let's start with the first story. Summer Spectacular is mostly free of dialogue because it's leading up to a punchline at the end. We see a city at night with some helicopters shining spotlights, and some aliens threatening humans with ray guns, and then a masked human swings in through the window on a rope, breaking it and magically not getting any shards of glass injuring her. Also, she magically avoids getting shot right away, and ducks behind a desk in an office. A teenager who knows her and calls her Summer gets attacked by the alien, and she takes off her mask for no reason while trying to look cool. She waits for the alien to come up to her and shoots them both with ray guns she must have gotten from Rick, and she walks away from an explosion carrying her boyfriend. Why was there an explosion? Wouldn't all of those innocent civilians have died in it? Then we cut to her in bed with her boyfriend like it's nothing, even though she's a teenager still living with her parents, and he asks her how she got another scar, implying she's had multiple scars, and he's asking about other scars. So, how did the previous story tell me how she got any kind of scar? We didn't see her react to any broken glass in her, so I really don't get it. The only apparent joke is that she's being portrayed as a surprisingly competent badass. And much like when Boom Knuckles is portrayed that way in imagined spots, I seriously don't see how that's just a joke, instead of just awesome and respectable. But the joke is that Summer's just a typical teenage girl normally, as we end the story by learning that the origin of her other scar was that she was using a hair drying thing on her hair while eating pizza on the toilet lid and burned herself. I guess because she wasn't using her dominant hand for the thing for some reason. This story kind of fell flat because I didn't get the context behind why the aliens were there being evil, and why she needed to be the one to stop them, and even knew about them at all. So what could have been a cool action scene for her was just really short and confusing. At the end of the day, she was only badass because she surprised some aliens with ray guns, and anybody with ray guns could do that, not just her. I can only assume that Rick and Morty were too busy at the time. In part 2 of Summer Spectacular, I don't see why it's a part 2 and it has nothing to do with the previous short. We see a bunch of damaged kitchen stuff like a fridge, an explosion coming from an open fridge, implying there's a bunch of gunfire, and a talking pizza gets shot trying to deliver urgent news from the front. Summer says to some other food people that they need a medic now. But while there was a great moment for her character as she was nice enough to hold the pizza person's hand and reassure him, pretty quickly after she's warned after they're coming, an explosion destroys him. So, who are the villains in this situation? Why is she in this situation? Why are the villains being evil? Again, there's holes in this story. But at least it's cool to see Summer being called a general, and bravely insisting that they've got a war to fight. We don't get to see how the situation ends, unfortunately, as instead, the story ends with her applying for a job, and the man at the job interview wants her to elaborate because on her resume, she wrote technically yes to experience with leadership and or food management. The joke is that she literally managed and led food, but they're food people. That doesn't count. And naturally, Summer doesn't elaborate because she knows he'd never believe her, so it was dumb of her to bother putting that on a resume. Wait, couldn't she ask Rick to make a device that would broadcast her memories on a screen that would prove that she's been in that situation to him? That would be a sweet thing of her grandfather to do. Shouldn't she have thought of that? I guess she never thought to bring home a souvenir to prove the truth of her claim. Again, it just wasted a potentially engaging and interesting story in favor of ending with a joke. Because we only saw it in the middle of the action, didn't know how it began. But it was cool to see Summer being a badass for once. But I'm more confused than anything. An Adventure to an Alternate Universe, which is a pretty lazy title because nearly every story in the series is like that, but maybe that was the entire joke. We start out in an alternate universe where Morty's acting like Rick, complete with having a lab coat, and his grandpa's sleeping on the couch all lazily and wears Morty's clothes. But Morty isn't about being lazy, that's actually more Rick's thing. So Morty's like Rick, but Rick's still like Rick, but not smart. It's surprised that this took until the comic to happen because this is such an obvious idea. It also makes more logical sense for Rick to be an unemployed deadbeat living with his daughter if it's because he isn't a talented genius who could be great at any job he tried. Though it does make no sense that a 14-year-old would be as smart as a normal Rick. Anyways, we start out with Morty Rick saying that he had a dream that he was the brilliant scientist. And his Morty says that dreams are stupid and don't matter. So what caused him to become a nihilist? He's not ugly Morty. It's justified for Rick because he had to deal with life for 80 years. And he used the freedom fight against the evil Galactic Federation Empire. But eventually realized that everyone's always trying to take over the universe. And so even the thing he dedicated himself to doesn't actually matter. So Rick Morty snarks at Rick, treating him like an idiot, when all he did was say he had a dream that he was smart, and tells him to bring him the screwdriver that looks like an X. So does he need his Rick waves to hide himself from his enemies? One of the questions of the series is why Rick doesn't just build a robot assistant to go help him instead of putting up with Morty all the time if he thinks he's a lame idiot. But the answer is that he needs his Morty waves, and he does care for him. So he'd think the robot was a lame downgrade he wouldn't like being around. But this version of Morty has never shown any hint in the small story that he's nice to Rick occasionally and cares about him. He says that he can't wait until the Council of Mortys hears about this. At least the comic tries as hard as it can to make you root for and understand Rick Morty when he takes revenge on him, but it's still a grisly thing that happens. We're lucky that it gave us at least some kind of discretion shot. It was ironic how sweet the normal Rick and Morty's interaction was for a change compared to the other versions of them, and all for the sake of a joke. Morty was going to the portal to that universe, and joked about staying in the world where Morty's in charge. It was self-aware of the writer to think of that potential plot idea and have Morty reference it, and not be predictable by having Morty actually do it. Wait, so if he's talking as if there's only one world where Morty's the Rick, out of infinite universes, then how is there an outright council of Mortys? I guess the Mortys are all clones instead. Rick ruffles his hair and laughs nicely and tells him to get in there, oddly not taking his joke seriously when him deciding to stay in there was a possibility for all he knew. And like I said earlier, they're horrified at the natural result of a Morty being a jerk to Rick so much. Unfortunately, we'll never know if Rick took revenge on the Rick who did that to his own grandson, because for all we know, the normally murder scientist just went back into the portal. My question is, why did this happen if this Rick is the Morty? Well, to be fair, there have been times in the show where Morty either tried to shoot Rick thinking he could have killed him, or even let him stay dead for a few days after he accidentally killed him. But the story's still implying that this is the inevitable and only possible result of the grandson being the evil genius instead of Rick, when this is supposed to be a universe where the Rick is just like Morty. We haven't seen nearly enough of the Morty-like Rick to see him really acting like Morty. We just saw that he somehow slept on the couch in the middle of the day long enough to have a dream when he has a bed, doesn't he? And Morty's not known for being like that. So this concept was only taken advantage of halfway. If that, because we'll never learn what made the Morty end up like Rick at his age. So the real question is, if this Rick is like Morty, and it's implied that this is the inevitable outcome because he's a Rick and that's scarier than Morty's, then what took him so long? It would make just as much sense if a ton of Mortys killed their Rick, because they'd have just as much of a reason to as he did. And again, he's intended to be the Morty of this universe. He's the idiot instead of the genius. And therefore he would be too stupid to not do something because of the consequences. So why is the only personality trait he's expected to have separate from all the other Mortys his evilness? Every Morty might do this eventually. It's not like we were shown more of the story where we saw the Morty like Rick being compassionate and naive like Morty. So he literally just feels like Rick if he was born an idiot because he's still just as evil. But then that really makes me wonder how his Morty is like Rick so much then, because he doesn't feel like they outright have their personalities swapped. Wait a minute, does the Rickest Morty here have an Operation Phoenix for himself? Because if he's as smart as a Rick, and Season 4 told us that the Immortality Clone Project is a very common thing for Ricks to the point where if one dies, they can wake up in another random dimension as a clone, you'd think this death wouldn't be permanent for him. He'd just wake up in a clone body and take revenge on his Rick when he least suspects it. I don't know what determines what dimension Rick went to after dying if the projects were somehow able to detect him dying from another universe, by the way. Maybe they detected a tracking device in him, not sending out signals anymore. I guess he went to the nearest dimension to him in the multiverse. But I don't know why he didn't just wake up in one of the other clone bodies in the same dimension and keep repeating that until all of the clone bodies ended up killed. And only then could he have woken up in another dimension that way. I guess in that episode, we were supposed to assume that through a coincidence, every single dimension we actually saw him wake up in, had him wake up in the only clone made. And that does make sense. Why would a Rick bother making more than one spare body to wake up in? That's extra effort he doesn't need. But it's confusing when you consider that in Season 1, we saw that Rick had tons of clones ready for him, not just one in case of death. But I guess the majority of Ricks have only one clone body. Or at least the Ricks we saw him wake up in the clone bodies of anyways. Because since Rick was presumably dealing with that scenario for days until he got to Wasp Rick, maybe he did wake up in the same dimension over and over again a bunch of times, and we didn't see it because it'd be redundant. Or maybe the hostile fascist Ricks just got rid of their clones so he would have to reincarnate in a different dimension from theirs. I guess those clone projects aren't compatible with a Morty, because to be biologically incompatible. An interlude with Jerry is the most boring one of all. Jerry just goes to the office like a normal person. The problem is that we don't see what his job is like to truly have a day in the life of Jerry. It's literally just one panel of him sitting at an office typing. Normally, he works in advertising, coming up with slogans. What was the point of the story if it's just one panel of this? The rest is him being a normal person, without even much dialogue. After dinner, he lies awake at night, goes into his car, and starts driving just to listen to the radio. Wait, really? Why doesn't he just listen to music on YouTube? Doesn't he have an MP3 player at least? He could listen to songs he actually likes, that he knows he wants to hear, but I guess he just finds it more exciting to take a gamble with the radio where you never know what you're going to get. More importantly, you could end up hearing a brand new song you'd really like. So it's just more showing him off as a normal person. Then in the morning, Rick snarks that Jerry always slaves away to make ends meet, and that he doesn't know how he has the determination to keep putting up with that and keep going in a world that continuously bothers him. You know, most of the time we see Jerry, he's unemployed, and the whole joke is that he doesn't have a job. This must be before he lost his job, which makes this ironic because he did lose the determination. The story ends with Jerry driving to work listening to the radio, as we're told in a text box that Rick had admitted, "You're a braver man than me," which was surprisingly sweet of him, to compliment him for once. It was interesting to see Jerry being portrayed with dignity for a change. It makes sense because he's a working man, and that's got value in its own. And it's more valuable than what Rick does in universe because he's actually stable and reliable when he has a job, while Rick's always getting into trouble when he does what only he can do. In Beth and the Beths, we see a bunch of alternate universe Beths playing a rock band together at a rowdy club for teenagers, and since the audience gave them such appreciation, it's clear why all those Beths agreed to do this on a regular basis to escape from their normal lives. Though I still wish I knew how they all met. We see a guy waste time grabbing the leg of one of the Beths, he gets kicked, and out of nowhere all of the Beths at once scream fight, and the crowd of people who just appreciated them suddenly all turn on them at the same time, when you'd think they all would have sided with the Beth who fought back against an annoying fan. That's unrealistic. The red-shirted Beth says she's gonna go home because it's 5:45, and she uses the portal gun to go home, and it turns out Jerry thought she went to book club, and she was letting him believe it. They sure have a great relationship together if he just settles for responses quick and boring as okay instead of asking for details like a good husband. Why did he bother asking how book club was in the first place if he didn't want to know any details? Does he care or not? It's very convenient that Rick never tried to find his portal gun, be able to find it, and found out that someone took it on him. Well, that was some nice humanizing of Beth. It makes perfect sense that she'd use Rick's portal gun to have some fun, and in a relatively safe way. In Dream a Little Dream of Me, we see Morty making a romantic speech to Jessica as they stare at the city, where he says that he's been all around the multiverse, so he's wooing her by being himself. He asked her to come with him and travel the universe. That would be an obvious idea to do in a story at least once, so we could see how she would react as an outsider from the family. So I don't know why the show never did that, when it already threw the dog a bone a little by having her be glad Morty went back to normal and agree to go on a date with him in the show. She hugs him, he carries her to his bedroom, but since things were going unusually well for Morty, it was obvious that things would go south quick for no reason. So suddenly she turns into Scary Terry because it was all just a cruel dream. of Jessica's instead of Morty for some reason. She then lampshades that she's got some stuff to work through. But sadly, that's the end of the story instead of us learning what that stuff was. I guess since dreams are symbolic, the intended meaning of the dream was that Jessica's subconsciously afraid that if she agrees to give Morty a chance, she'll just end up hurting him, disappointing him, which is represented in an exaggerated way to get the point across to her as her turning into a monster. So she's insecure. It could also be that she's worried that in all the wacky things that happen in Morty's adventures, she could literally end up being transformed into a monster. But why wouldn't he try to tell her about his adventures? I mean, it's such an easy conversation starter. Also, the reason she's able to dream about Scary Terry to the point of knowing what he looks like is a combination of, one, since we see him multiple times instead of him just existing in the dream of a person in a dream, somehow that's possible. Scary Terry is some strange dream-traveling alien that can go to any dream, even the dream of someone within a dream, even though they only exist as a mental construct in the dreamer's brain and aren't really a person with a brain themselves, because Inception was apparently that stupid. Just the fact that him getting lucky with Jessica is constrained to a dream was already going to be cruel to the audience who spent a long time wanting the plot idea of his crush on her to progress at some point, instead of staying a stagnant, unfunny joke by him dating her. So it's good that at least they try to cross the line twice by having it be more than just the predictable thing that it was all a dream. By the way, the trope of catapult nightmare is unrealistic. She'd just stay lying in bed and groggily wake up. She wouldn't immediately have the energy to get up and scream when that bother everyone else in the house. For Into the Void, we see Morty scared in a dark bedroom, and Rick just asks him what he's doing, totally missing the expression, and says he's not going to change the channel because this is his time. Morty says that he can't stop thinking about today because apparently they'd almost died, and he asks him what death is. Rick calls him spoiled and tells him to come with them without asking questions. He goes to the garage and amuses me by saying at a time like this, "I hope you're happy, Morty. I was right in the middle of an Alf marathon, but from a dimension where he actually gets to eat the cat." Then he reveals to me that apparently Alf wasn't being literal when he said he wanted to eat the cat, and it was just a euphemism that slipped past the censors in a children's show. I never saw that show, but if that was supposed to be a euphemism for something innuendo, I guess the only reason people ever figured out it was meant to be that was the context. Because just hearing that, I really did think it meant that. Naturally, an alien like Alf would want to eat a cat, because he's an alien. Maybe that's what his species would want to do. Anyways, he gives Morty a device telling him to use it. He says that it's a box that magically shows him what death is like, and all he has to do is look inside it. Apparently, it's a thing that bored teenagers do in other dimensions. He says that he could know what lies beyond the veil if he wants to. So this would mean that Rick would have to know what the true religion was. And it can't be Christianity, since he's always snarky about religion in this series. And the only religion he'd ever react to is mainstream organized religion. And he just doesn't care, so he won't worship anyone anyways. Morty says he might not like what he sees, and Rick says that this is why he stays up all night watching Alf marathons. This convinces Morty not to look in the box. So this implies that what he would have seen in the box was hell. Of course Rick would have seen hell. Normally Morty's a compassionate, naive person though, even if he's not above corruption and moral failings himself. But he's still clearly the morality pet to Rick. So Rick's probably just making an assumption that he'd see the same thing as him. You'd think he'd at least clarify to him that he saw hell, and so there's a chance Morty won't. And he spent so much of his life inconveniencing people that he thinks he could never do enough to make up for everything, so that he wouldn't go there. Or more likely, because of his immortality project giving him all the time he needs, he just doesn't care. And of course not. Anytime he dies, he just reincarnates into a Rick clone. Even in another universe. So he'll never go to hell anyways. Which makes the pointless Rick Goes to Hell side comic that he'll be ignoring completely and utterly contrived. Because he'd never go there. If all he's talking about is hell, you'd think all he'd have to say to Morty is that there's a hell. And considering that Morty has been forced to do bad things in his adventures with Rick, including shoot a soldier of ugly Mortys, maybe he's right in assuming that Morty would go to hell at this rate. Again, I counted, and the Morty in the show has killed like 79 people. But I don't think hell would be very fair, because Mortys are basically given no choice but to do the bad things they do when they're on adventures with Rick. Like they tend to only kill when fighting back in self-defense. So that might not count. But maybe the idea is that they could at any time say no to Rick and just go home instead of participating in whatever evil plan he's got going on. Also, if Morty's gonna go to paradise, then him seeing what death is like would cause him to kill himself so that he could go there. So Rick would want to avoid that as well. In the next story, Jerry and Rick's Day of Fun, Rick tells Morty not to eat too many pancakes because his friends visiting from Microverse need a place to stay, and he says, "I know just the grandson." And naturally Jerry's uncomfortable, and he says he's off to a job interview, but the implication is that he's not really going to one, as he's not all dressed up, and the interview is coming out of nowhere to them all. Suddenly, it turns out he's going to spend time with Doofus Rick from the show. So this is our show's Jerry, presumably. So the title was foreshadowing, kinda. It was sweet to see the good version of Rick call him an old pal and hug him. And he gladly hugs back and says it's been too long. Jerry's also nice enough to actually call him by his official name of Rick J19 Alpha 7, which is an extra bit of effort because that'd be hard to memorize. It's so awesome that the show thought to have a good Rick. It also shows some needed self-awareness because it was confusing that they had an evil Rick, when that's redundant because nearly every Rick is evil. So why is he the only one who admits it and is called that? How would anyone measure that he's the evilest Rick and quantify it and notice it when so many of them are already jerks? And how could it be totally logical that of course his Morty's the evil Morty because he's evil Rick? He's only slightly eviler than every other Rick instead of an outright morality flip to them. So his Morty wouldn't have a reason to be completely morally flipped. It'd make more sense for an evil Morty to be born evil in a world with a Doofus Rick. A good Rick, if we're going by the there's a morality flipped universe logic for evil Rick. Anyways, Doofus Rick uses the portal gun so he could be sweet enough to give Jerry a day of fun with them. They met because the Council of Ricks visited Jerry's house in the show, by the way. Jerry shows off a shirt with a picture of the two of them on it, and Jerry and Rick Day of Fun on it. He must have gotten that shirt personally made, because you couldn't just buy that anywhere. And Doofus Rick is impressed by the shirt and calls Jerry smart, so it really is a shirt Jerry made. So he learned how to sew? That's impressive, I guess. Doofus Rick says that no wonder he works in advertising, and wishes that he was creative like him. It's sweet of him to acknowledge the good in Jerry for once. He may look like a doofus, but he's crowning moment of heartwarming and a character. And this series needs genuine, not subverted, heartwarming moments like this. He casually says he discovered the cure for cancer last week in his dimension, and is humble enough to say that it's not the same feeling as coming up with a cool slogan for a t-shirt. It makes it all the more tragic that not every Rick is like this. I think a normal Rick's reasoning for not finding the cure for cancer with his genius would be that there's infinite realities. So what difference does it make if he finds it when that'll just help one reality? He could then bring that cure knowledge to every other reality, but that'd take a lot more effort. There's an infinite amount of universes, so he'd be trying to do it for an infinite amount of time. So ultimately, the excuse is just laziness. Rick revealed that he made the cure for tuberculosis in the show, and I'm at least letting myself believe that he gave that knowledge to his planet, so the cure isn't being hoarded in his garage for no reason. Come on, that'd be a pile of money waiting to happen for him. He would not patent that. But my point is that it probably took forever just for him to discover the cure for tuberculosis, let alone another disease like cancer. It's a lot of effort when you could just watch Alf marathons all day. Also, maybe there's only a specific strain of cancer that this guy cured, and his cure wouldn't work in other realities with slightly different diseases. Because otherwise, Doofus Rick would have no reason not to constantly travel to every dimension and bring them his knowledge of the cure for cancer, unless he found out it never worked in other zones. But another thing that's great about him is, there's no proof that he isn't doing that. He is genuinely a heroic Rick trying to do good with his genius, so maybe he is bringing it to other universes. It sure is a good thing that in all the zone traveling of the Ricks, none of them die of diseases they don't have an immunity to or accidentally bring diseases home. But this inevitability was at least kind of addressed because there was an episode where one of the family members brought an alien parasite home. That's kind of like that. But yeah, aside from the laziness excuse, I think the biggest reason we're supposed to believe only a Doofus Rick would cure cancer and most Ricks contrast him is that cancer is just one problem. Most Ricks are bitter nihilists fed up with the world from experience, so they probably just scoff at him as simple-minded and not getting the bigger picture because there's billions of problems out there. What's the point of focusing on and solving one problem? With so many problems, how could even a Rick make a real difference? But Doofus Rick's nice enough to think, well, at least I'm making a difference with this problem. He's humble enough to settle with what he's got and determined enough to not give up and get discouraged. Anyways, we see a bunch of brief panels showing a montage of how they had fun together, with each panel having a different thing shown so that we can be shown the largest variety of things at once for a short story, which is great. They went on a rapid rapids water ride, seeming to enjoy it more than the people behind them. They went to a zoo, jokingly walking like the penguins. Jerry panics because he's trying out a jetpack with him and his jetpack stutters while he's upside down, so presumably he had to be rescued. So it's realistic, not all of his day of fun with him was perfectly ideal and positive. Usually taking advantage of Rick's selfish inventions tends to backfire, and this is naturally the case with a Rick, no matter how nice he is. We also see him playing catch with Jerry like a surrogate father. He is another version of his father-in-law. It's so unlucky for him and hard to believe that in all of his years of life, the Doofus Rick never had a wife and ended up with a Morty of his own. That he has to have a Morty given to him from another dimension instead. And even then we don't see him here because this is his day with Jerry. Realistically, bullcut or not, you'd think that after like 60 years, Doofus Rick would be nice enough that not only would he have had a wife, but he'd still have a wife. The whole reason Ricks don't have wives is because their marriage failed because they cared more about science and gadgetry than being good husbands. A Doofus Rick would have chosen his family over science in a heartbeat and easily gotten a girlfriend. But apparently his hairstyle is just that unappealing to women, not to mention his eye problem. But again, he's been alive for like 80 years, and you'd think he'd eventually change his hairstyle. But I guess he's just happy with who he is. Naturally, because he's got nothing to feel guilty over. So he wouldn't feel like he had to change his hairstyle just to validate himself by getting a girlfriend. Not to mention drown his sorrows in alcohol. We haven't seen him drink yet. He'd get lonely eventually though. But a woman who'd never give him a chance just because his hairstyle wasn't right for him anyways, and he might know that. Also, Simple Rick was a Rick who chose his family over science, and he didn't have a bowl cut like Doofus Rick. So what does that imply? Not every Rick who's not a Doofus Rick has to be evil. We also see that Jerry and Doofus Rick got a ton of photos of themselves making silly faces in the photo booth where they ended up by laughing. And we also see them hitting some drinks together at a bar. This is exactly the kind of story that we really should have seen with Scourge and Fiona. I know that a comic book has limited space to it, and a comic story showing the long conversation they'd have to have had to justify why she would have sympathized with Scourge and given him a chance as a friend would be a long story with mostly just dialogue. So I guess that wasn't much of an option, but Archie's had stories with mostly just talking before, and at the very least, it could have shown us a montage of Scourge and Fiona just like this, where every panel is them at a different, obviously fun place. That should have been a backup story of issue 172. Because this kind of story isn't exactly hard. But this comic is a lot better than that one, clearly. Doofus Rick says at dusk that this might be the best day of fun yet. I guess Jerry's family is so caught up in their own lives and are so self-absorbed that they don't find it suspicious how long Jerry was gone for a mere job interview. None of them thought he was kidnapped or went missing and got worried about him and asked for Rick to use a tracking device locator to find him. It makes sense. Jerry's the last person anybody in the house would think about. Jerry lampshades at last. Why can't I just, come live here? They could raise Eric Stoltz and Mask Morty together. It's very good that they have this pointed out and explained away, because that is a very obvious idea. Doofus Rick puts his hand on his shoulder and says that he sees him as a son he never had, and he couldn't put his family through the kind of heartbreak of him leaving them. The sad part is, as the end of the story shows, his family wouldn't miss him all that much anyways, so that's a moot point. Beth just snarks at him because she's the only one in the house with a job. So, was Doofus Rick just blissfully unaware that Jerry doesn't work in advertising anymore because he needs to go on job interviews? I guess he meant that he usually works in advertising. Doofus Rick's just being idealistic. That and Morty and Summer really got upset for all of Season 3 when Beth divorces Jerry. So they actually do want him around. Imagine how they'd feel if he outright left their dimension. At least in Season 3, he still lived on their planet, and they had scheduled time with him because of the divorce. Though it's a small multiverse when Rick has a portal gun. so the kids could go visit him whenever they wanted, but still. So yeah, they hug and Doofus says he'll be counting down the days before they go see each other again, 4 weeks from now. And when Beth snarks at Jerry for a justified reason, he looks down at his secret shirt sadly. Doofus Rick's story is probably one of the best, if not the best story in the Rick and Morty comic. It's just so heartwarming and sweet. It doesn't matter if this is a dark franchise, that just means it needs sweet moments that aren't subverted more than anything so you won't get apathetic and irritated. Maybe one of the reasons I was annoyed by how dark Archie Sonic got at the end was that it didn't have nearly as many heartwarming moments like this to make me like and get attached to the characters, and make me forgive them for their idiotic mistakes. Doofus Rick may look silly, but he's a bundle of joy. Now for a Blumbus Carol. Fortunately, considering what we know about Blumbus, Morty decides he's seen enough TV before he could see that guy get eaten. It's realistic that at least he doesn't know how he got here and is not okay with it. But again, it's ridiculous that this became a popular tradition in that dimension. And what's the point of showing Blumbus again if they won't explain how it became common and acceptable? And since Morty was almost in that guy's position, it makes sense that he had to leave, but for some reason he only says he's leaving because he's tired and wants to go to bed. I really don't know why he'd want to watch that. And I guess he really didn't want to watch it because he immediately starts dozing off. Somehow. At that point. Not a very good story so far. Especially since it seems like it'll just rip off the Christmas Carol, which really shouldn't be so common in the media. Like maybe someone should renew the copyright on that story already. But at least it'll be kind of interesting because this is Rick who's in this role, and Rick is a really interesting character to watch. He's immediately genre savvy at the ghost in his dream. At least I assume it's a dream because of the odd lighting around him when he wakes up to the spirit of some guy he once looked at the bus stop. So he already knows he's going to be visited by 3 ghosts. It was amusing that he snarked at seeing his portal through time. Ooh, a portal! Scary! Never saw one of those before. And he's looked at in annoyance instead of confusion. Sadly, the story doesn't go anywhere near reaching its true potential because the past, present, and future are all 1 panel each. It's really disappointing that we don't get a lot more elaboration on his past. It wouldn't require that much guts because this isn't the show's Rick, it's the comics Rick. So it wouldn't be using up story ideas telling us his backstory too easily, or whatever the lame excuse is. At least we get a glimpse because we see a kid him crying alone in front of a toy. But he's crying for apparently no reason. It doesn't look like the toys are broken. It's not like we see his father be mean to him. Which would have been really easy to write and explain part of why he became such a dick. When showing us the past of a villain, showing how he suffered to become evil is so obvious. Also, since the past him had white hair, I guess he had intentionally given himself that look so he looked like a mad scientist to celebrate his genius. At least it was amusing that right after we see young Rick crying, we see Jerry crying over the exact same toy. But again, it's confusing. The future panel is the laziest of all. We see Rick see his gravestone, but that's all it amounts to. It doesn't even tell us anything. This was by far the laziest plagiarism ripoff of the Christmas Carol ever. I even liked the version of it with Sally as Scrooge and Sadie M a lot more than this. Because at least it was sweet at the end that Sally hugged Tails and was determined to spend more time with her friends. And she was perfect for the role of Scrooge because it's so like Sally to get so absorbed in work that she thinks is important and not focused on just enjoying life with her friends. But here it's all constrained to a short story, and worst of all, it's Rick, so of course he was bored the whole time and didn't change after this. He just happily goes back to watching the same sick show he watched before. I guess that show's intentionally a horror show. I mean, if horror movies can somehow manage to attract an audience, maybe it's not unbelievable that this show would too. At least it was amusing to see how sad the ghost was, but the ghosts really were idealistic to think they could change Rick. He's a genius. Of course he would have done enough thinking to know how his future was bleak and people didn't really like him. They couldn't be telling him anything new. Also, this last panel proves that it wasn't all a dream. So I remember that later in the comic, Rick denies the existence of ghosts and is proven wrong. Well, I hope that's a different Rick from this one then. Because this Rick clearly found out ghosts are real, though he's not surprised and questioning it at all. So he really must be a different Rick. One already familiar with the existence of ghosts. The story was just confusing, off-putting missed potential. They should have severely cut down the amount of panels focusing on the Blumbus show, and just focused on elaborating on his past. That was the obvious good idea to do for someone like Rick. It's not like he'd be less appealing by being less mysterious. I mean, it's already obvious that there are only two clear-cut Freudian excuses for him. He got disillusioned with the futility of freedom fighting, and we learned in the show that he wanted his father's approval badly enough that he told a hive mind to gather everyone who resembles his father to cheer him on in a stadium. So he's not that mysterious as it is, because he doesn't have an infinite amount of possibilities for why he became evil and what his past is like. It'd just be nice to learn a little bit more about his past than one extremely vague panel saying that, of course it sucked, because intelligence equals isolation. So, Rick can make anything. Was he too moral at that point to be against brainwashing his family to be kind to him so he wouldn't end up crying like this? I guess so. Because otherwise he would have had a wonderful childhood because he'd have used his gadgeteering to make everyone nice to him his whole life with brainwashing. Actually, I forget if Rick has been shown to be capable of brainwashing. That would be an overpowered Storybreaker power if he could do it really easily. It'd wreck the tension of everything because there'd be a subtle plot hole. Why didn't he brainwash his way out of it? It's like time travel in the it makes every problem easy department. So maybe he can't brainwash because that'd be too easy. And most obviously, he might have let that corrupt him and taken over the world by now if he could do that his whole life. It couldn't be that impossible for him to make a chip in a person's brain that would make them release dopamine every time they did something nice for him. So I guess it really is that he's morally against it.